whispered Hub.
Once upon a time, there was a writer who lived in a small town. He loved to write books, but nobody knew about his talent. He would spend his days in a tiny room, scribbling away on his stories. The room was quiet, with only a bed, a table, and a chair. There was also an old mirror on the wall, but it was no ordinary mirror. Sometimes when the writer looked into it, he saw another man staring back at him. This man had a beard, unlike the writer. One day, as the writer sat at his desk, he suddenly felt a craving for coffee. He put down his pen and went out to the shop. When he returned, his pen was nowhere to be found. He searched high and low, but couldn't find it. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. That night, as he lay in bed, the room was eerily quiet. Suddenly, he heard a voice, a man's voice. "Who's there?" the writer cried out, but there was no answer. He searched the room, but there was nobody there. As the days went by, strange things kept happening. The writer saw the other man in the mirror more often, and sometimes he felt as though someone was watching him. But he was determined to finish his book, so he stayed in the room. However, one night, the other man appeared by his bedside and whispered, "You will leave here. You will stay with me." The writer was filled with fear and decided to leave the room the next day. But as he packed his things, he looked into the mirror one last time and saw something terrifying. The other man was sitting at the table, writing with his pen. The writer knew he had to leave, but he couldn't shake off the feeling of dread. The next day, the writer left the small room behind and returned to his hometown. But no matter where he went, he couldn't escape the memory of the other man in the mirror. Haunted by the strange events, the writer couldn't focus on his work. He tried to forget about the other man, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that he was being watched. One day, as he passed by a bookstore, he saw a familiar face on the cover of a book, a face with a beard, just like the one he had seen in the mirror. Curious, he picked up the book and flipped through the pages. To his horror, he realized that it was his own book, but he hadn't written it. Determined to uncover the truth, the writer went back to the small room where it all began. He stood in front of the mirror and stared at his reflection, waiting for the other man to appear. Sure enough, the other man appeared in the mirror, smiling back at him. "Who are you?" the writer demanded, but the other man remained silent. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. It was a friend of the writer's looking for him. The writer tried to call out to his friend, but no sound came out of his mouth. The other man opened the door and greeted the friend, pretending to be the writer. The friend couldn't see the writer standing there, invisible and voiceless. Filled with anger and frustration, the writer realized that he was trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't escape. Desperate to reclaim his identity, the writer searched for answers. He spent hours poring over books and researching the strange phenomenon that had taken over his life. Eventually, he discovered that the other man in the mirror was a ghost, an entity that had latched onto him and stolen his voice and his words. Determined to break free from the ghost's grip, the writer sought out the help of a spiritualist. Together they performed a ritual to banish the ghost from the small room once and for all. As the ritual reached its climax, the room was filled with a blinding light. When the light faded, the writer found himself standing alone in the room, free from the ghost's influence. Overjoyed, the writer reclaimed his pen and sat down at the table to write. With each stroke of the pen he felt his voice returning to him, stronger than ever before. From that day on, the writer vowed never to take his talent for granted again. He continued to write, sharing his stories with the world and never forgetting the harrowing experience that had nearly robbed him of his voice.
The voiceover in this video is done by Whispered Hub. Copying or reusing the content is completely prohibited.